And welcome to part 3 of our 6-part series on looking at the United States in the Cold War, American foreign policy from 1945 to 1972. And we were talking from the framework of our last presentation, yesterday in fact, of Harry Truman, and he is re-elected. Of course, he is the incumbent, and he is re-elected in November of 1948, but it's still ranked as the most shocking of all victories in American presidential history. And when he begins his term in office here in 1949, little did he know of the challenges that in fact were going to be ahead in the very, very near future. For there had been this ongoing tension in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. In 1947, the United States is going to pass the Truman Doctrine, stressing that the Americans will defend any nation, anywhere in the world that is opposed to communism. So you have this shift away forevermore from isolationism into interventionism. And in 1949, in the month of July, the Soviet Union successfully tests its first atomic bomb. This is not found out in the United States until the CIA brings it forth in August of 1949. But it shocks the American population to the extreme. There was almost a sense on the part of the U.S., we have this super weapon. We have this super weapon that was used in Japan to bring about a more rapid end to the war in the summer of 1945, VJ Day. And nobody else in the world is going to get this super weapon. Well, it was a bit naive on the part, a bit overly idealistic on the part of the United States or the American public. And they're not really prepared at all, as I referenced yesterday, for this monumental transition here, because now there's this nuclear parity. It's going to set off this arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, and both nations are going to up the ante, building as much in their respective nuclear stockpiles as possible. Well, that was a very difficult pill, so to speak, for the American population to swallow here in the late summer of 1949. But to make a bad situation worse, in 1949 also, on October 1st, the nation of China is going to fall to communism. As Mao Zedong and the communists will effectively defeat in the midst of this Chinese civil war that has been going on since 1946, they'll emerge victorious against Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. The nationalists or Kuomintang forces are going to be forced here off of mainland China, off to the island of Formosa, or what is present-day Taiwan, and the largest nation in terms of population then as now has effectively become a communist nation. Well, this added insult to injury as far as the United States was concerned. What the Republican Party had been saying is they grasped on to this anti-communist crusade of sorts that's going on across the United States at this stage, and they had stressed that the Democratic Party, the party that was in power, was in fact soft on communism. Soft on communism. Well, we saw at the conclusion of our presentation yesterday that it would be this junior senator from the state of Wisconsin, Joe McCarthy, who's going to grab on to this concern, this alarmist tendency here, almost bordering on national paranoia, of the threat that the Soviet Union in fact formally offers. The Soviets have the atomic bomb. The Soviets, by the same token, were behind as far as many Americans were concerned. They were behind the fall of China, Red China. We lost China. How could this have happened? We have yet this other massive victory of communism. It is this monolithic movement that is going to eventually come to our shores. Well, it's at this time period where McCarthy is going to pick up on this and run with it. And he runs with this on the basis of stressing that he has the names of 205 known communists in the U.S. State Department. Now, this is huge. This is huge. And you have an emotionally charged nation to begin with. And now it's a sense that both political parties, both the Republicans and the Democrats, stop and pay very, very close attention. 205 known communists. This is a very easy explanation as to how the Soviets got the atomic bomb, as to why we lost China. And McCarthy is going to continue these accusations, as we stressed in our conclusion yesterday on the floor of the U.S. Senate. He's going to say, well, there's 57 known communists that I have in my hand. A few days later in Reno, Nevada, it's going to be 81 known communists.
And you have this atmosphere of fear across the United States. Fear of being infiltrated by communists, undermining the national security of the United States. Well, as McCarthy, who's going to become this tremendously prominent figure, as he's going to become this larger-than-life individual in the spring of 1950, the problem is, as we get into the month of May, is he has not forwarded the name of even one communist. He had 205 in Wheeling, West Virginia on February 9th, 1950, but now it's May. Now it's May and not one communist has come forward. He is being fed this information, being given this information from J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, and a lot of the names that were on the list had nothing to do with communism. They had been security clearances here in the U.S. State Department, and in this sense, he's going to claim that they had communist tendencies or communist beliefs or whatever the case would be. Well, as the criticism is going to continue, especially coming from Democrats who were very, very careful because they did not want to be labeled a communist and have their political careers effectively ruined, McCarthy would stress that even one communist in the U.S. government is one communist too many. And he is going to root out this corrosive evil once and for all. Well, we stressed here that the only person to challenge him directly was Margaret Chase Smith. And Margaret Chase Smith is a Republican senator from the state of Maine. And as far as she's concerned, initially she was very much alarmed at these accusations that McCarthy was making. However, months had passed and not a single communist had been brought to the surface. And in this sense, she started to see McCarthy as more of this demagogue, quite frankly. This right-wing autocrat who is really obsessed with his own power, has this cult of personality surrounding him, etc. And she puts forth a declaration of conscience. And in this declaration of conscience, she stresses that in the United States, a democratic state, that there is this need for freedom of speech. And it shouldn't matter of one's political beliefs, whether you're an extreme right-winger or you're an extreme left-winger or a communist. It shouldn't have any impact at all. You have the right to speak. And is simply to quell this speech once and for all. And to destroy people on the accusations with no proof whatsoever of them being a communist is something that is very, very wrong. It's gravely evil. And she puts this forth to her own Republican Party. And she is able to convince 6 Republican senators to also sign this. She's not a staunch conservative Republican by any stretch of the imagination. She's in fact very, very much of a moderate. Well, they signed this Declaration of Conscience, which was written by Margaret Chase Smith. And when it's brought before McCarthy, McCarthy dismisses this as Snow White and the 6 Dwarfs. Well, his campaign is going to continue. It is going to continue. Harry Truman will be stressing here in the early summer of 1950, and beyond for that matter, that there are no communists that he knows of in the U.S. State Department, and this is nothing more than political grandstanding on the part of the opposition party. McCarthy would respond to that it's been 20 years of treason on the part of the Democratic Party, going back to the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. And we're going to root out this communist menace once and for all. His campaign continues, not just in the summer of 1950, but onwards into 1951, 52, etc. Where it was all going to end was anyone's guess. Well, Margaret Chase Smith, in her years of service, both as a member of the House of Representatives as well as a member of the U.S. Senate, this would be her shining hour. As she reflected back, she lived till she was 97. As she reflected back on her political career, she as well saw this as such. It's something that she should be very, very proud of in this time of tremendous paranoia across the nation. She was the exception in terms of cooler heads prevailing and really starting to question this crusade on the part of the Wisconsin senator. Well, as 1950 progressed, Harry Truman, who had already been dealing with the fallout from the Soviets and their atomic bomb, from the fall of China to communism, and now with the start of McCarthyism, as it was going to become known as, an even greater concern loomed on the horizon. And the greater concern that loomed on the horizon here was the nation of Korea. Korea. Now, a little bit of background information regarding historic Korea. The
Japanese, as we can see, here's a map actually from World War II in the Pacific Theater. And you can see the island nation in dark red off the coast of mainland Asia, the nation of Japan. And the Japanese, in terms of to put it in terms of power politics, you have, for example, in the Middle East. In the Middle East, in the Arab world, the creme de la creme are the Egyptians. Okay? The Egyptians pretty much see themselves as far superior to the Saudis and the Jordanians and the Palestinians, and the list goes on and on. Well, in the United States, I should say the Americas, okay, the Americans, the residents of the United States have a very patronizing attitude towards our neighbors to the north, the Canadians and the Mexicans, as well as the residents of Central America, South America. Americans pretty much see themselves as it. There's this loftiness. Well, in Asia, it's the Japanese, up to and including the present day. And the Japanese, as an island nation, were the first Asian power to industrialize, putting them in the top 5 nations of the world at the dawn of the 20th century, along with Germany, Britain, France, and the United States. And Japan, as an island nation like Britain, who established the largest empire the world had ever known in the 19th century, the Japanese, because of the shortage of raw materials, also needs room to expand. And in 1894, the Japanese end up in war against China. The Japanese are in a state of complete and total superiority. The Chinese, by comparison at this time, are hopelessly backward. And in this war, in the Sino-Japanese War in 1894, the Japanese prevail. And they take from China the historic Korean Peninsula, as you can see on the mainland here of Asia. They take the Korean Peninsula here in 1894. As the 20th century progresses, the Japanese, a powerful entity, China, not a powerful entity, not in any way, shape, or form, Japan is going to start pushing its way and expanding its way into Chinese territory, in particular, eyeing up a region of China known as Manchuria. Well, in the 1930s, the United States is going to begin protesting this. And the reason the Americans are protesting this, quite frankly, is because the United States is looking for greater economic interest as well in China. There's this following of this open door that in effect for quite some time. Classic examples of more prominent nations like the United States, Britain, Germany, France, Japan, in a more prominent position to really dominate here less nations, less prosperous nations like China in this regard. So the U.S. government in the 1930s is really upset with the Japanese because they're pushing into Chinese turf. And the reason the Americans are upset is because the Americans really want this. They have a great deal of economic interest here as well in China because it's just a bundle of opportunities. Well, the Americans and the Japanese eventually will experience here this falling out by 1937, as Japan is not going to just take a good chunk of Manchuria in China, they're going to take it all. And they're going to rename this territory part of their empire, just like Korea, Manchukuo. Well, what happens is the Japanese and Americans, of course, eventually are going to end up in World War II, following Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Japan loses here against the Americans, of course, VJ Day in 1945. And Japan, as a nation, just like Germany that we discussed yesterday, ceases to exist. It is open to the military occupation here of the United States almost exclusively. There are British contingent forces and Soviet contingent forces there as well. But pretty much the headmaster through it all is this great general, Douglas MacArthur. He's going to oversee here the military occupation of Japan beginning in 1945. Japan ceases to exist, and Japan loses its colonial empire. It loses Manchuria. It's going to lose as well the Korean Peninsula. Well, the question became one here in 1945 as to what to do with Manchuria, what to do with Korea. And a decision was made that Manchuria would go back to China. China here is soon going to be in the midst of a civil war in 1946. And as far as the powers that be were concerned, regarding Korea, the Soviets wanted Korea to become a communist state, the Korean Peninsula. The Americans, surprise, surprise, wanted here Korea to become a capitalist state, to become here a strong supporter of the United States. The U.S. can pour a great deal of economic aid in, make Korea very, very strong, modernize the region 100%. Well,
Well, the two sides can't agree, so the decision is made here on the floor of this new international body, the UN, the United Nations, to partition Korea. Right along the 38th parallel, pretty much right across the middle. And they're going to make this here a communist North Korea and a capitalist South Korea. Now, this partition was meant to be temporary. It was not going to be permanent, not in any way, shape, or form. And eventually, what the plan was here in 1945 was to hold open elections, and the Korean people could decide themselves. Do you want to be dominated here by communist North Korea and Kim Il-sung? Or do you want to be led or dominated by capitalist South Korea and the American handpicked successor, Syngman Rhee? Well, partition, quite frankly, wasn't working here for either side. Not in any way, shape, or form, because what it did immediately when it was enacted in 1945 is it really divided families. You couldn't cross the border. And suddenly here was a sense of complete chaos. You had brothers and sisters who were living in the north, you were living in the south, you were in school in the south, near Seoul, what the case would be, etc. It really created a great deal of problems, a great many problems. Well, the stress here was that it was going to be temporary. It would in fact here be temporary, not permanent. Well, what we have is a serious problem. And this problem here that is going to emerge is what to do regarding historic Korea. The United States is pushing for open elections to be held. They want open elections to be held. It's written here that open elections are going to be held. When isn't exactly clear. But the Americans want open elections to be held because they know that their guy, Syngman Rhee, leader of capitalist South Korea, is going to win and win with ease. It's time to modernize the Korean Peninsula, and who better to have as your friend the United States that you can just pour literally billions of dollars into Korea and make it this vibrant Asian force at some point or another, economic force if nothing else. Well, the Soviets know, and Joe Stalin knows full well, there's no way the North Koreans are going to win. They don't have a chance. So the Soviets, therefore, are completely opposed to any sort of elections, at least into the indefinite future. So the situation here remains. Well, in April of 1950, Dean Acheson, who is Harry Truman's Secretary of State, specialist there, of course, in foreign policy, Dean Acheson is giving a press conference in the White House, and he is asked by a reporter, now that the Cold War is going on, we're in the spring of 1950, what areas in Asia does the United States deem as directly tied to its security? In other words, where is the Truman Doctrine in Asia going to be applied? Acheson walks over to a map here in April of 1950, comparable to this one, and he basically draws a line. And he draws this line right here. And he stresses that everything east of that line, meaning Japan, all the islands, etc., all the way to the United States, everything east of that line, which includes Japan, is of direct American concern, direct American interest. The United States will defend that territory. Plain and simple. To the west of that line, not as significant. Well, to that west of that line is Korea. It's Korea. What impact this had on North Korea is not entirely clear. You have this partition along the 38th parallel. It is still in effect 5 years after the end of World War II. You have this communist leader, Kim Il-sung, who really wanted to see a united Korea under his leadership, under his jurisdiction. By the same token, you have a South Korean capitalist, Syngman Rhee, who is looking for a united Korea at some point or another. He's pushing for open elections because he knows he's going to win at some point in the near future. But right now, Korea is still in limbo. It's partitioned along the 38th parallel. The impact here that Acheson's comments have regarding Asia, you can see more so in terms of the line that was drawn, is debated up to and including the present day. But what is happening, and what the United States knows of, for sure, is as follows. the CIA has determined and has informed here the Truman administration that the Soviet Union has been delivering to North Korea T-34 tanks, these Soviet tanks. So it's a concern here over the course of the early weeks of June of 1950 that something's going on here in North Korea. Soviet weaponry is being delivered as well in increased numbers, or increased amounts, I should say, to communist North Korea. And on June 24th, 1950, in the pre-dawn hours, suddenly, North Korea launches an all-out invasion of South Korea. So communist North Korea is going to launch this invasion of capitalist South Korea. You can see in terms of capitalist South Korea, those two big red lines. They're the communist forces coming right on down the peninsula. The goal, the focus, the objective is to destroy this capitalist government of Syngman Rhee, this government of South Korea, and unify the entire Korean peninsula under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, the communist. Make it here a communist satellite state to the Soviet Union, through and through. Well, when this happens, Harry Truman calls his cabinet into an emergency session. And from the perspective of Truman, he believes it is imperative for the United States to make a strong stand, or take a strong stand here, against North Korea, for he also argues the Soviet Union is behind it. The North Koreans are going to say that they acted on their own, without any sort of directives coming from the Soviet Union or anyone else. That's difficult to believe. Because the Soviets are arming them, they're sending them T-34 tanks, and it's a bit of a stretch to consider your communist leader Kim Il-sung launching this all-out strike south of the 38th parallel in the Soviet Union. The Kremlin in Moscow has no idea that this is going to happen. I don't buy it. Okay, far-fetched to say the least. Well, Harry Truman is convinced the Soviet Union is behind it. And because the Soviet Union is behind it, this plays a role with the Truman Doctrine. That the United States will defend any nation anywhere in the world that is opposing communism, opposing the Soviet style of communism. By the same end, Truman is concerned not just with South Korea falling here in the month of June of 1950. He's even more concerned here of this as a potential springboard for the communists to launch an all-out invasion of Japan. Not so far-fetched. It is imperative, Harry Truman stresses to his cabinet, we made a tough stand in Europe, and we had to, here in the opening salvos of this Cold War. Now, we also have to make a strong stand here in Asia. Well, the South Korean army and South Korean government is literally falling apart here in the summer of 1950. And Harry Truman reaches out. He reaches out to this World War II hero from the Pacific Theater, General Douglas MacArthur, who always considered Milwaukee to be his hometown. Well, MacArthur has not even been in the United States, quite frankly, since the 1930s. It's been almost 20 years, quite frankly, that he's been gone. He leaves the United States, he is stationed in the Philippines, and he becomes here this larger-than-life character, especially in the Pacific War here, over the course of the Second World War. Well, Douglas MacArthur reviews the situation on the ground in South Korea, and he sends word from Tokyo to Washington, D.C. to Harry Truman, and he said, listen, without significant assistance, South Korea is doomed. They're going to fall apart probably in a few weeks at most. You got to decide what you're going to do. What Truman decides, what he decides here, is to send, on June 30th, 1950, 2 U.S. Army divisions from Japan to help the South Korean army stave off this assault from the communists in North Korea. Now, these 2 Army divisions, quite frankly, they had been stationed for some time in Japan, and it's pretty easy. I mean, they're just kind of like hanging around. Military occupying forces. The Japanese aren't going to give them any troubles. Douglas MacArthur was actually very, very prominent, very popular with the Japanese people here as well, despite the fact of the U.S. military occupation. It's not permanent, it's transitional. And Truman, by the same end, knows that he has to act and act fast. Well, we have the three branches of government, and it's imperative that not one of the three becomes overly powerful, because it can abuse its power with tremendous ease. So you have the system of checks and balances going back to civics all the way in grade school here as American citizens. What Truman does not want to do is to ask Congress for a declaration of war, because as far as he's concerned, we don't have the time for that. Harry Truman, therefore, is not going to call this a war because Congress has to approve it. Instead, he's going to call it a police action. So the correct name here for Korea, it's a war and everything but name. The correct name here, though, is a Korean conflict, which will last from 1950 to 1953, because the United States will technically never declare war here on Korea or on the North Koreans. And adding to this, Harry Truman is going to reach out to his European allies and get them to join along with the United Nations in this UN initiative. UN initiative. Now, 90% of these forces coming from outside of South Korea to help the South Koreans, 90% are going to be from the United States. 10% will be from other UN nations. One of the other prominent nations here would be Britain. No surprise there, they're very close allies. And when this is introduced, when this is announced on June 30th, 1950, the American population overwhelmingly supported it. 75% of the U.S. population here supported this goal, this objective. And what was this goal? What was this objective? Very simple. To reestablish this 38th parallel. You can see it right here on our slide. It's mission accomplished. What we've got to do is we've got to drive these communists from North Korea back above the 38th parallel. We reestablish it. It's over. The conflict has come to an end. Not an inch. They are not going to be given 1 inch here. Open elections will eventually be held. South Korea will emerge victorious, and we'll have our capital as South Korea. It's just going to take some time. Well, what happens is the U.S. forces, as they're arriving, they're not really in the best of situations. Because in Korea, on the Korean peninsula, up to and including the present day, summers are ungodly hot. Full-blown humidity, 90 degrees to 105 degrees, and it's not so much the heat as we would say here in Milwaukee, it's the humidity. Hey, with those long days of July as they start setting in. Not only that, the winters are bitterly cold on the Korean peninsula. Fahrenheit, routinely temperatures can drop to 15 to 20 below 0 Fahrenheit without any wind chill even. That's just the temperature itself. So you have here the extremes. Well, the second thing is that the American soldiers, as they're arriving here on the Korean peninsula, they're not in the best of shape. They've been hanging around Japan, which everything has been very, very calm, no doubt about it, had been for some time. They hadn't been practicing a lot of military maneuvers because they didn't need to. Now suddenly they're thrown into action in a matter of about 6 days. By the same end, they are not all that well supplied. Yes, they have enough food, they have decent clothing, etc., but they don't even have enough water. And the problem here is that they would start, because they'd run out of water in the summer heat, in July of 1950 and into early August of 1950, so they would start drinking here from puddles in the rice field. Well, the problem, and water in the rice field, the problem here is that the rice fields where human waste was used to fertilize these fields. So now you've got the American soldiers becoming incredibly sick because they're drinking here water that's contaminated. Not a good start, not by any stretch of the imagination. Well, Harry Truman is going to ask Douglas MacArthur, who's 70 years of age at this time, if he would in fact look over the situation and see what could be done. The goal, the focus, the objective, reestablish the 38th parallel in this conflict. Well, MacArthur had become this larger-than-life figure. He graduated at the top of his class in West Point in 1903. In World War I, he served the United States in the Western Front. He went in as a major. He emerged here in the backdrop of the First World War for the U.S. as a brigadier general, was wounded 2 times in the Western Front. He became the chief of staff of the Army in 1930 at just the age of 50, which is the youngest ever in all of U.S. history. He was then sent off in 1932 to the Philippines. A 5-star general in World War II, he was this huge figure, this mythical figure for the American population. And what made him all the more of this larger-than-life individual is that he had not been back to the United States for almost 2 decades. Well, MacArthur, in another time, in another life, another place, would have made a superb actor. Superb actor was his true calling. And MacArthur was this individual who had created and spent a good deal of time here creating here this aura of invincibility and brilliance and excellence. And the problem is he also started to really believe it. He was very arrogant, very domineering. His staff was always instructed to refer to him as the general, like there were no other generals in the U.S. Army anywhere. He would oftentimes talk of himself too in the third person, which is very, very strange. When he talked of himself in the third person, he referred to himself as MacArthur. It'd be something along these lines. MacArthur has decided to take action. MacArthur will set off the field. MacArthur will lead us to victory. Wow. I shall return in World War II. You probably remember the photograph. He's getting off, his pants here are soaking wet. He's strolling back, walking with a vengeance back in a land that he had to withdraw from some years before. That was all staged. The photographs were all taken 2 days after the invasion actually happened and the transition actually happened here across the board. Franklin Roosevelt couldn't stand it. Franklin Roosevelt called him the most dangerous man in America. Believed firmly that if MacArthur was ever given any power, he would be corrupted by it instantly. Harry Truman had never met him. But in a conversation that they did have, going back and forth, Truman was a bit taken aback at MacArthur's seeming overconfidence. To which Harry Truman began referring to him as Mr. Prima Donna. Well, MacArthur is planning here, as August of 1950 progresses, he's planning a very risky operation. And what the first thing is to help get the American troops, and now UN troops that are coming in small numbers to join the American troops, along with the South Koreans, to get things together and to plan to launch a counterstrike against the North Korean Communist Army. MacArthur has basically zero respect for the North Korean Communists. Nothing more than Soviet puppets, will easily be able to annihilate them and reestablish the 38th parallel. Of that he's certain. What he's planning to do here is as follows. It's more of a stalemate now in the field in August and into early September of 1950. And if you look in terms of those 2 red arrows, this shows to some extent, the impact that the North Korean communists have here, and that South Korea, literally 80% of South Korea, is under the control of the North Korean communists. With the exception of this area right here, the area surrounding Busan, even the capital city, Seoul, is under the jurisdiction of the communists. Well, what MacArthur is planning in September of 1950 is as follows. He is going to take the U.S. and UN soldiers who are stationed here at Busan, in the southeastern corner of the Korean Peninsula, and he's going to begin driving them out, striking positions against the North Korean communists. Then, that's not the heart and soul of the attack. Why? Well, the North Koreans didn't expect this. It's got to come from there. What he is going to do is he's going to take at least 13,000, possibly as many as 15,000 U.S. Marines, and he is going to land them at Incheon, which is an area completely dominated and controlled by the North Korean communists. Here's Incheon. Now, what he is doing is so risky because he is convinced by landing here these 15,000 soldiers, these 15,000 American Marines at Incheon, it's going to catch the North Koreans off guard. Yeah, probably, possibly. But remember when we were talking earlier this year how Dwight Eisenhower was chain smoking and chain smoking and chain smoking, obsessing about D-Day, June 6, 1944, and worried that the whole operation was going to get thrown right back into the Atlantic, that they wouldn't be able to establish here a beachhead at Normandy. Normandy would be a cakewalk in terms of getting soldiers on Omaha Beach or Utah Beach compared to Incheon. Incheon would have, at high tide here, it would have waves on average of 30 feet high. You have a stone structure in the harbor built around to keep the waves from crashing into the city. And you're going to be landing 15,000 soldiers in this potential nightmare? They could all drown. They could all be swept away. MacArthur's convinced it will work. Very, very convinced here it will work. And on September 15th, 1950, Harry Truman's praying to the nth degree. September 15th, 1950, MacArthur launches his operation. And what happens is he is able to land these 15,000 Marines at Incheon. By the same token, he is driving out of Busan the U.S. and UN forces, pushing the communists back. It works brilliantly. Holy mackerel. The North Korean Communist Army is caught completely off guard. Now they find themselves in this huge vice. That's closing and closing here in a very, very striking fashion. Tens of thousands of North Korean Communist soldiers are going to die over the course of the next 5 days of fighting, as the U.S., UN, and South Korean forces here clearly have the upper hand. Tens of thousands more are going to surrender to the U.S. UN forces. Literally, by September 25th, 1950, the capital city, Seoul, is liberated from the communists of North Korea, and the North Korean army, what's left of it, has been thrown back above the 38th parallel. October 1st, 1950, the 38th parallel has been officially reestablished. Mission accomplished. Wow. Douglas MacArthur, who had been so unbelievably successful over the course of his military career, and especially in World War II, in fairness to the guy, this takes him to the stratosphere. This is, without a doubt, his finest hour. Military genius. As the word starts spreading across the United States, the American population overwhelmingly supports this. Think back, think back, think back. Remember the television series MASH. Remember Alan Alda, Hawkeye Pierce, asking, why are we here? What are we fighting for? What's this all about? Kind of almost something of a pacifist. That would not be at all accurate for Korea, not in the least, in any way, shape, or form. The overwhelming majority of Americans supported this, reaching now a crescendo peak of 93% according to the Gallup poll in early October of 1950 of support for this war. And it would continue here having this tremendous support throughout. Alan Alda, you have to think about it. I mean, the television series, I think to the best of my knowledge, lasted 12 years. The Korean War lasted 3. But it's a case that the outlook there also has to be viewed by American cultural history in Vietnam, which we'll also be talking about here in the Cold War. Okay? So it's more tied with Vietnam than it would have been with Korea, but Vietnam was too recent, of course, and in fact was ongoing technically even when the series started, so that wouldn't have worked. Well, what we have here, mission accomplished, 38th parallel reestablished. Douglas MacArthur reaches this unbelievable height following this victory. Well, what was left of the North Korean army was an estimated 40,000 soldiers. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And President Harry Truman sends word here to General MacArthur congratulating him on this astounding victory. MacArthur sends word back to Truman saying that what we need to do while we're here is to now cross the 38th parallel. We've got him on the ropes and knock out communism in North Korea once and for all. Harry Truman is leery of this. I mean, it sounds appealing. MacArthur tells him there's nothing left of the North Korean army. Nothing at all. We could end this in probably a matter of a few weeks. Just give me the green light. That's all I need. Well, Harry Truman is leery because it might smack of U.S. imperialism, but in a larger framework, his even bigger concern is China. Because if we look here at our overhead, you can see that dotted line in North Korea. That's the Yalu River, Y-A-L-U, the Yalu River, dividing communist North Korea from communist China. And China, of course, came into existence October 1st, 1949, after a long, drawn-out civil war. And the problem, as Truman sees it, is that, oh yes, it's appealing to just knock out the communists in North Korea. They started it, after all. We'll finish it. But what if the Chinese get involved? What happens then? This is a conflict, the Korean conflict. Our goal was to reestablish the 38th parallel. We reestablished the 38th parallel. MacArthur is adamant that this will work and work with astounding ease. Truman said to him here in October of 1950, "Is it okay if we meet and talk about this?" MacArthur said, "No problem, but I'm very busy." MacArthur here is going to meet with Harry Truman. He has a relatively short flight to Wake Island. Harry Truman is going to be flying over 3,200 miles from Washington, D.C., all the way to Wake Island for this historic Wake Island Conference. And at the Wake Island Conference, the plan, the goal, the objective is to discuss on October 15th, 1950, as to whether or not the U.S. and UN forces should cross this 38th parallel. Well, at the Wake Island Conference, here's a photograph of the two gentlemen on that day. Let's just describe this as happier times. At the Wake Island Conference, MacArthur basically stresses, let's cross the 38th parallel, and we can knock them out, what's left of the remnants, probably 40,000 soldiers, we can knock them out in a couple of weeks, unify all of Korea under Syngman Rhee's jurisdiction. Truman said, I'm concerned, not so much that it's not going to work, I'm very, very confident, General MacArthur, that it will work, but my concern here is with the Chinese, that the Chinese might get alarmed that we're not even respecting, we're not even recognizing their government, we're not going to, and that they're going to come across the Yalu River to help defend communist North Korea, the communist Chinese. And they were just in a civil war for 3 years, and you've got here hundreds of thousands of battle-weary veterans who know exactly what they're doing, and the U.S. Army is tiny by comparison. We're in peacekeeping. We're peacekeeping units, plain and simple. We're going to be overwhelmed. MacArthur said that won't happen. Truman said, how do you know? He said, it won't happen. I'm a military man. I know these things. Truman said, okay, for the sake of discussion, well, let's just say you do invade, and the Chinese do come across the Yalu River. MacArthur said that's not going to happen, as I've said before, and if it does, which it won't, we can take the U.S. Army and just, U.S. Air Force, and just blast the Chinese to smithereens. Teach them a lesson they won't forget. Harry Truman is still very, very concerned at his first and only formal meeting with Douglas MacArthur. But he said to MacArthur, okay, I will approve this. And it's imperative to understand, the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. He is MacArthur's boss, not the other way around. So Truman okays it, provided that the U.S. and UN forces remain at least 25 miles south of the Yalu River. He doesn't want to get too close here to the Yalu River. Truman then is going to board his plane and head back to Washington, D.C. October 15, 1950, the Wake Island Conference comes to an end. Well, what happens here is just 2 weeks later, MacArthur authorizes this all-out assault into North Korea. And literally, the North Koreans are virtually nothing. They're going to be cut to smithereens, quite frankly. It's just like bedlam on the part of the US and UN forces. Very, very little resistance here whatsoever. But what MacArthur did is he disobeyed his orders. And MacArthur is not only going to go within 20 miles of the Yalu River, he is also going to press right up against the banks of the Yalu. And in late October, here just a few days after North Korea is literally on the ropes, late October of 1950, suddenly the United States is thinking that they are getting new POWs from North Korea. But what they realize instead is that they've got now suddenly hundreds of Chinese communist soldiers who are surrendering and are becoming POWs instead. There was the red flag. On November 1st, 1950, Communist China is going to send tens of thousands of soldiers across the Yalu and into North Korea. What happens here is the US and UN forces are going to be blown back, blown back, blown back, blown back. The American and UN forces will be outnumbered by mid-November of 1950, 10 to 1. 10 to 1. Oh my God. This is exactly what Harry Truman did not want. He authorized it, because how could I be so stupid to listen to MacArthur? And what happens here is by early December of 1950, not only are the US and UN forces blown out of North Korea, they are pushed by the Chinese communists hundreds of miles into South Korea. This is a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. What Truman wanted was a limited war, a police action. Now, suddenly, he has this massive conflict, something he did not want. And, to make matters worse, Douglas MacArthur, who is telling the President of the United States how it was all going to pan out, is going public now in early December of 1950 and openly criticizing the Truman administration. Now, MacArthur said, I'll unleash the Air Force if it happens, which it isn't going to happen because the communists of China would never even think of invading North Korea. But if they do, which they won't, the U.S. Air Force will blast them to smithereens. Well, he unleashes the U.S. Air Force and it doesn't do a damn thing. They just keep coming and coming and coming. They're used to the conditions, far more so than the American soldiers. They're veterans here of this Chinese Civil War. And the US and UN forces are just getting pushed right back well into South Korea. Now, it is an entirely new war. MacArthur goes public, and he blames his setback entirely on the Truman administration. He said, American people, I want you to know that my hands have been tied. We would have won this war weeks ago had it not been for the inept administration who is presently in the White House. And what we need to do here is we need to get Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, the Kuomintang, involved in this war in Korea as well. Because the future of the Cold War, the future of communism is in Asia, not Europe. Privately, he is urging Harry Truman to unleash a nuclear strike on cities across China. Oh my God. He is then stating publicly, when Truman said absolutely not, it's not going to happen, he is then stating publicly that we would have won this war, American people, Douglas MacArthur is saying. But once again, my hands are being tied. MacArthur could not take defeat. MacArthur could not take criticism. And you have here a very, very serious problem. Thousands of American soldiers are going to die here in the Korean War in the month of November of 1950. And what you have here for Harry Truman is the perfect storm. An absolute and complete nightmare. A war he did not want, which is now suddenly before him. The pressure on Harry Truman by early December 1950 was enormous, as well as the pressure that was on the U.S. military. Well, Truman had this boyhood friend, went all the way back to Independence, Missouri. Remember, one of his mantras for this journey of life is never forget a friend. Charles Ross. Now, Charles Ross had been his press secretary. Since Truman became president all the way back in 1945. He's only in his early 60s. And here on December 5th of 1950, he suffers, Charles Ross, he suffers here a massive heart attack and dies. Well, that evening, Harry Truman was to be going to Centennial Hall in Washington, D.C. to hear his daughter Margaret's recital. Now, for Margaret, she's the only child of Harry and Bess. They're very, very proud of her. And she was this aspiring singer. But it was a sense of what annoyed many music critics is the fact that she was an average singer at best. And the only reason she was getting all this attention is because she's the president's daughter. Well, at this singing recital that evening in Washington, D.C., a music critic was there, Paul Hume, from the Washington Post. And what happens is Paul Hume writes this scathing review of Margaret's performance that evening, saying that, well, at some point she was actually in tune. She couldn't hit many notes. This has been going on for 3 years now. She has shown absolutely zero improvement. And the best part of the evening was when the so-called concert formally ended. Well, he publishes his review in the Washington Post. The following morning, in the Oval Office, Truman was always an early morning riser. He sees this review. And Truman absolutely freaks out. Now, have you ever done this in your life? God knows I have. That you are so angry and you sit down and you write something or you tell somebody off, and then after the fact you're like, oh my God, what did I just do? Or the next day, oh my God, maybe a year or so later, what was I thinking? If Charlie Ross had been alive, there's no way Harry Truman would have said this. He would have said, no, it's not going on. He had died the day before. The Korean War was weighing on Harry Truman heavily. And what he does, basically, is he threatens Paul Hume, the President of the United States, that for his lousy review of Margaret Truman's recital the evening before, and stresses that if I ever see you again, you basically are going to end up with 2 black eyes, and you're going to need some support down below. You're a gutter snipe. He has a big cut back in the 1950s. Gutter snipe. Who has no talent whatsoever to write such poppycock. And he mails it. Well, when Paul Hume gets this letter, he takes it to the editor of the Washington Post and here, get this from the President of the United States. And the editor of the Washington Post said, oh, this is great. And the following day, they put it on the front page. Now, this is at a time that thousands of American boys have already died in the Korean War in the month of November alone. And the rage towards Harry Truman across the nation was overwhelming. Absolutely overwhelming. And letters poured into the White House criticizing him for something as inconsequential as his daughter's singing recital. The hardest letter for Harry Truman of all to bear arrived with a Purple Heart enclosed, and it stated the following: Mr. Truman, as you have been directly responsible for the loss of our son's life, you might as well keep this Purple Heart, this emblem, on display in your trophy case, as a memory of one of your many historic deeds. One major regret at this time is that your daughter was not there to receive the same treatment as our son received in Korea. Oh boy. It really hit home. Truman took the letter with the Purple Heart inside, put it back in the letter, and kept it in his desk drawer all the way through the end of his life, in December of 1972, as a reminder that you think before you speak. By Christmas of 1950, the UN forces, headed by the United States, were pushed almost back to Busan. They had lost over 300 miles of territory in less than 1 month. Well, MacArthur was becoming all the more prominent, basically now going behind Harry Truman and contacting Republican senators. One gripe after another. All the problems that he'd have, blaming them all on Truman. And on the ground here in South Korea, because MacArthur is pretty much operating everything from Tokyo, General Welton Walker, the day before Christmas Eve of 1950, was killed in a Jeep accident. And he was replaced by Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway. Now, Matthew Ridgway is somebody like, I introduced yesterday, George Marshall. I was talking about the impact that George Marshall had here on American society, this unsung hero, quite frankly. Well, I would say that Matthew Ridgway belongs in the exact same category. Somebody who's very, very humble, who didn't toot his own horn, so to speak, would fly underneath the radar, call it what you will. Ridgway had planned and executed an airborne division invasion of both Sicily as well as the airborne invasion here at D-Day on June 6, 1944, in the backdrop of the Second World War. And when he arrives in Korea, just after Christmas Day of 1950, he was appalled at the low morale, as well as the bad food and clothing that these U.S. and UN forces were wearing. And most striking of all, the poor intelligence gathering. Nobody had a clue where the North Korean communists were, where the Chinese communists were, etc. What he does at the start of 1951 is he operates, or I should say he responds, with Operation Ripper. Operation Ripper. And Operation Ripper is a striking counteroffensive here launched by the U.S. and UN forces against the Chinese communists primarily. And in Operation Ripper, here January, February, well into March of 1951, the U.S. and UN forces start driving the communist forces right back up to the 38th parallel. To the stage that by the time we get to the end of March of 1951, the U.S. and UN forces have regained most of the territory south of the 38th parallel. It's a huge, huge step in the right direction in this Korean War. Well, as 1951 also progressed, the Supreme Commander here, Douglas MacArthur, kept pushing for an escalation of the war. He wanted Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists involved. He wanted the United States to invade China. He wanted a draft to be put forth here to bring more and more soldiers from the United States into this conflict. And Harry Truman stressed in January of 1951, you are not to say anything else, General MacArthur, without us agreeing ahead of time, my office agreeing ahead of time to what you're going to be saying, and we need to know exactly what you're going to be saying ahead of time. A gag order effectively has been placed on MacArthur. You can say nothing without clearance. MacArthur ignored Harry Truman. And he started to stress here in early February of 1951 that Asia needs to be the major focus of the Cold War. That a limited war is unthinkable. Harry Truman sent word to him once again, say nothing. As a commander-in-chief of the armed forces, silent. MacArthur ignored it, stressing that the United States needs to make use here of its weapon superiority, meaning nuclear weapons. We need to use nuclear weapons against the Chinese communists. Omar Bradley, who was an advisor, a World War II hero of the European theater, really couldn't stand Douglas MacArthur. In fact, most generals couldn't in the U.S. Army because it was always all about MacArthur. Omar Bradley stressed to Harry Truman, you've got to do something. You got to fire him. Matthew Ridgway, in March of 1951 in the White House, grabbed General Hoyt Vandenberg, top military advisor as well here to Harry Truman, and stressed, why is MacArthur able to get away with this? He won't follow orders. You can fire him, can't you? MacArthur was stressing. He was stressing that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all the top military brass, supported his decisions. He supported here decisions. And he sent letters in late March of 1951 to prominent Republican senators to be read on the floor of the U.S. Senate that stressed, the United States must be in this war in Korea to win. Otherwise, Harry Truman and his cohorts need to stand trial for the deaths of thousands of American boys, as well as treason. Holy mackerel. As far as Harry Truman was concerned, that did it. He had told him 7 times, not another word, MacArthur could care less. Harry Truman knows that his actions are going to be very unpopular with the American people. He could care less. He was never after a popularity contest. On April 11, 1951, President Harry Truman fires General Douglas MacArthur. In the aftermath here, a Gallup poll that was conducted across the United States as there was tremendous shock. 69% of the U.S. population supported General MacArthur. 27,000 letters and telegrams flooded the White House in the 2 weeks that followed his firing. And those letters and telegrams, 20-1, were against Harry Truman. In January of 1951, Harry Truman's approval ranking stood at 22%. Following MacArthur's firing, it dropped to an all-time presidential low of 14%. MacArthur returned home on April 19, 1950, to a hero's welcome. Ticker tape parades in New York City, as well as other prominent cities across the United States. And he would address here a joint session of Congress. And it would be in this joint session of Congress, if you ever listen to the full tape of it, it's interrupted by standing ovations 22 times. And it's where he stressed that famous line of, old soldiers never die. They just fade away. Harry Truman was asked later on that day of April 19th, 1951, what he thought of Douglas MacArthur's speech, the joint session of Congress. Truman responded, I thought it was 100% bullshit. How do you really feel, Harry? Give him hell. Over 10 million spectators were present for the New York City ticker tape parade. And for a while, the Republican Party considered here in April and into May of 1951 drafting him as the Republican nomination for the White House. Yet, MacArthur faded rapidly in the months that followed. He reaches his apex, and indeed, he fades away. First and foremost, reasons for this. First and foremost, American newspapers pointed out that Harry Truman is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, not Douglas MacArthur. Second of all, MacArthur had been warned and warned and warned. A gag order had been placed on him by his superior officer, the president, and he chose to ignore it. Third, MacArthur had always been saying that the Joint Chief of Staff, the military experts here, supported him 100% regarding the need for the escalation of this war in all of Asia. The Joint Chief of Staff responded, not one of us did. He's lying. Not one of us supported it. Where he's getting that from, we don't know. Number 4, Omar Bradley stated that MacArthur's policies, what he was planning here in the Korean War, would put the United States in the, quote, wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, against the wrong enemy. Matthew Ridgway would assume full command here of the U.S. and UN forces in 1951, and the war would continue. What Truman is searching for over the course of 1951, as he knows he's dreadfully unpopular, he is searching for a way out. Some way of reestablishing that 38th parallel, if at all possible, against the North Korean communists and the Chinese communists and getting out once and for all. But the problem here is this, it's political. And the problem is what the United States has is over 90,000 POWs. Chinese communist soldiers, North Korean communist soldiers. And at the bargaining table here, at the negotiating table over spring on the summer of 1951, what the U.S. is demanding, they can reestablish a 38th parallel, roughly a DMZ zone, that's not the big concern. But what the United States is demanding here politically, in its idealism, quite frankly, something it should be credited for, is that if these POWs from communist China or communist North Korea, if they want to defect, remember that word from the Cold War? If they want to move to the United States and become American citizens, they should be granted permission to do so. And as far as Kim Il-sung of communist North Korea and Mao Zedong of communist China are concerned, the answer is no, absolutely not. That's not going to happen. It's going to make communism here look backward compared to capitalism. So it is this sticking point. It is this sticking point here. This impasse that will keep the Korean conflict going. Over 37,000 American soldiers are going to die in this war. It's oftentimes referred to as the Forgotten War. And 45% of the casualties over the following 2 years, the remaining 2 years of the war, would take place at this time. At places like Heartbreak Ridge in September of 1951, Pork Chop Hill in April of 1953. Ambushes, mines, bombs, the extreme heat, as well as extreme cold, and no ground gained along the 38th parallel. How to break through all of this is not entirely clear. But for Harry Truman by 1952, one thing was for sure. He was not going to be running for re-election that coming fall. Yet by the same end, he was very, very optimistic that at the end of the day, he knew first and foremost he has done his absolute best. And second of all, he was very confident that history would be kind to him, especially in relation to Douglas MacArthur. And in that case, he was 100% correct. If you ever get a chance, Harry Truman's biography, written by David McCullough, called simply Truman, is, in my opinion, the best biography as a historian I have ever read in my life. Somewhere
somewhere Harry Truman owes a tremendous debt of gratitude to David McCullough. Because Truman here comes forth the person he was, very down to earth, very straightforward, very no nonsense. A good and decent man. Well, his successor is going to have to sort out the formal end of the Korean War. And as 1952 progresses, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party know who they want. They know straight out, no doubt about it, they're after the same guy. And they're after Dwight Eisenhower. The Democrats see Eisenhower as their only chance, this war hero from the European theater. Somebody who, like Omar Bradley, who worked for Eisenhower, flew under the radar. Somebody who, by the same token, is this absolute genius in being able to see the big picture. Eisenhower has a reputation at this stage of being not bright. Not the sharpest knife in the drawer. But it's also an image that Eisenhower gives off as well. And you have here this individual who's Stephen Ambrose, originally from Whitewater, Wisconsin. His primary biographer, Stephen Ambrose, refers to Dwight Eisenhower in his opening salvo of his biography as a great and good man. I would agree with that as well. The Democrats see their hope in this apolitical person, Dwight Eisenhower. But in the early summer of 1952, as he refuses, he's not going interested, he's not interested, he's not interested, suddenly he decides he is interested in running for the White House. This World War II hero, this mastermind behind D-Day, the largest amphibious landing in all of human history, informs the Democratic Party that the boy from Abilene, Kansas has been a lifelong Republican. And he's going to run the Republican ticket here in 52. What Eisenhower is going to do, the image that he has, the image that he puts forth, will be wildly popular, is somebody who's disengaged and is going to give a lot of jobs and tasks off to members of his cabinet. The reality here is this person is obsessed with work. And his concern is this out-of-control arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. He had lived through World War I, he had been a major part of World War II, and he's very much afraid that these two nations, each with a respective nuclear stockpile to blow up every inch of the planet 3 times over, could find themselves engaged in a nuclear exchange. The impact that Eisenhower is going to have in the Cold War will be extraordinary. And we will see this in our presentation next time. Thank you so very much. Any questions? Any questions at all in terms of, yes ma'am?
Why did the MacArthur and the president, Harry Truman, decide to meet in Wake Island when it's a very tiny?
Yes, that's a great question. I think it was a way that Truman wasn't comfortable just in terms of communication going back and forth. So I thought you'd give him more time to mull it over, to think about it here on his flight across the U.S. and then well across the Pacific to meet with MacArthur and to formalize more so, because it was tempting. I mean, indeed, Truman was convinced we can easily knock out the North Korean Communist Army, and they could have. The concern was the Chinese communists. So basically it's a way of a face-to-face meeting. They'd never met each other. They'd communicated with each other, but never actually formally were introduced face-to-face. And so it would be a way Harry Truman liked to do things, especially if it was very important, face-to-face. And Truman his fears ended up coming to the realization, so he ended up being right in that regard. Things could have been different, I think, if MacArthur had either remained quiet about it or had gone public and taken full responsibility. I mean, for example, we'll see later on in this series the Bay of Pigs invasion, April of 1961, and John Kennedy. John Kennedy was told by the CIA, in particular by Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA,
that if we land here these anti-Castro Cuban exiles in the Bay of Pigs on Cuba, it's going to bring about this massive anti-Castro revolution, and he's going to be overthrown. And it was a no-brainer. It was a layup. Quite frankly, as far as Dulles made it seem to the American president who had just begun his presidency just a few weeks before. And what happens? It's a complete fiasco. And what does John Kennedy do? Well, he goes public over the airways that evening to the American population, and he takes 100% responsibility for this fiasco. And then after that, Allen Dulles is going to be pushed into an early retirement from the CIA within a few weeks. But he takes full responsibility for it. So, I think that things had been different. MacArthur is going to praise himself for enchant, but by the same end, he was wrong in terms of crossing the 38th parallel in Chinese communists. Things could have been very, very different then, but if you're going to accept the credit, you're also going to have to accept the blame when it's obvious that you're at least partly responsible, if not fully responsible. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So where'd you get all that information?
Where get all the
Out of
information?
one book, because I'd like to buy a book about that.
The one book about...
My husband is a retired, he was in that war.
The Coldest Winter, I would say, is a really good. I think it's David Halberstam, if my
The
memory
Coldest
serves me
Winter?
correct. Yes.
Thank you.
Is a very, very good book. And it's the Forgotten War. It's called the Forgotten War because World War II, of course, so completely overshadows since 1945. Okay, history books since 1945. More than 1 out of every 2 history books have been written about World War II directly or indirectly. So you have this monumental war, and then you have the Korean War, and then you have Vietnam. Okay, so Vietnam is considered America's longest war, 1954 to 1975. We'll be talking about that here in our series as well. So I think what happens with Korea is that it's completely overshadowed by both World War II and Vietnam. And so that becomes more of a challenge. And I think that its transition, you can say now you have a Korean War memorial, and there's been a far greater attention paid, and it's long overdue. There's no doubt about that. I mean, you could also argue there hadn't been a World War II memorial until recently, and the vast majority of World War II veterans, including my father, are already gone by that stage. But how proud they would have been. But, from that generation, it would have been something like, oh, that's very nice. We really don't deserve it. The impact of the greatest generation was astounding, as we talked about in our series earlier this year. So you have these issues and these challenges, and for Dwight Eisenhower, it's not going to be easy. I mean, it's a case of he's one of 7 boys. His poor mother, born in Abilene, Kansas. So we're talking about it more in detail, but he gets this after World War II. He gets this letter from Columbia University asking him if he'd be interested in becoming the new president. And he's like, well, this is cool. I don't have a job right now, so yes, by all means, I think I'd be interested. Well, the reality is this. His brother, Milton Eisenhower, was a nationally renowned educator. He had been already a university president at 3 different places, including, I think, the University of Chicago, also Penn State. And so the letter was supposed to go to his brother Milton, but it went to Dwight instead. And so Dwight Eisenhower was like, cool. So he said, yes, I'm willing to accept this. What are we talking about in terms of salary, etc.? And so, well, we made the offer to this World War II hero, so we better follow through on it. So the problem here is that when he goes to Columbia in the late 1940s, the faculty has a very, very patronizing attitude towards him. This is where the whole thing becomes one of, he's not bright. Woodrow Wilson, who I may have used before as a commentator, is a former president of Princeton University before he became president of the United States, and was president, of course, during World War I. As a former university administrator, he hit the nail on the head, and he said, the reason why academic infighting is so intense is because the stakes are so small. I could not agree more. As an academic, I have never seen a group of adults acting more like children. Of course, they'd say the same thing about me, probably, too.
But there's a great deal of truth to that. So this is where the moniker really comes forth. From the city of New York, from Columbia University, that Eisenhower, this mastermind behind D-Day, is not bright. And something he doesn't care. It fits his image. The image and the reality are two different things. And he was always confident, too, that he would be able to look back and realize that history would be very kind to him, at least in the White House. He wasn't so sure about World War II in fairness. Yes, Joy.
Did the Soviet Union, did they drop their atomic bomb on Kazakhstan?
Yeah, they were testing
And
the
was
Ural
that
Mountains.
ally?
Yes, in different places. So we'll get into this as well, because we'll get into the hydrogen bomb, which is actually tested during the Truman administration. We'll get into the arms race, especially with the Eisenhower administration, because that's when the two respective nations, it really heats up between these two across the board. So yeah, and at the time, the Americans and the Soviets, in fairness to both nations, I'm not being an apologist for them, but they had no idea of the impact of radioactivity, of radio fallout from these bombs. And the hydrogen bomb, for example, at Bikini Island is tested, I believe in 1950. Now to put this in its proper perspective, the hydrogen bomb in 1950 was 100 times more powerful than the bomb the Americans dropped in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. So you had fishermen, Japanese fishermen, who were 400 miles away who became gravely ill from radiation sickness. 400 miles from ground zero. So slowly but sure, by the early 1950s, the Americans and Soviets are starting to realize, okay, this is very, very dangerous, and it's expensive, and it's also here. The Americans could keep up, though. Remember, what the U.S. would do, and I give this a credit to both political parties across the board, the Republicans and Democrats agreed that in terms of U.S. foreign policy, what it became one is 80% of it is financial aid. You can influence a great many nations by giving them economic aid, or withholding economic aid, or increasing it, or reducing it. And the U.S. has diplomacy and assistance down to an art form. And they have this propensity, remember, because 75% of the world's capital was controlled by the U.S. in 1945. And it's only 6% of the world's population. So you're sitting pretty, quite frankly, and you're sitting pretty for decades to follow. I'd say up to and including the present day. Quite frankly, the U.S. still does the same thing. It's better than war. And I mean, there's a compliment, to the U.S. So despite the political bickering and the grandstanding and the posturing, two of my favorite lines, the Democrats would say regarding Republicans and the liberals would say about conservatives, that a conservative is a person with two perfectly good legs who has not learned how to walk. To which the conservatives would say, a liberal is a person with two perfectly good legs planted firmly in the sky. Well, very, very good. I'd say pretty accurate in fairness. As Tim continues his best to try and walk down the middle of the road here in this political polarization. Any other questions? Swing on up. It was wonderful being here, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you. God bless.